scheduling a week of activities to discuss all matters HCI of various flavours. Now, we wanted to do this for various reasons. So those of you who are already kind of members of this community will perhaps know the HCI conference, and that's a big annual event that happens every year. And many of us go to that event. And this year it was cancelled. We would have all had a lovely trip to Hawaii, but that didn't happen. And we did think at the time that maybe we should have some kind of online gathering, some kind of online discussion, present our work in different ways. And different universities, I think, around the world have been trying different formats for doing that, trying to explore different ways of disseminating their work in the absence of what has been kind of an annual get together to physically meet up. So this year we thought we would obviously perhaps start trying to do something virtual. And I think certainly on the Open Lab side, we spent a bit of time thinking about when we would do something and what we might do. And the when felt like something that should be pushed back in the year. I think we were quite conscious that actually doing something in that week that HCI was traditionally happening was perhaps not the best of ideas, because there's so much pressure, I think. And that's one of the things that the current circumstances, I think, has been particularly revealing of, those ways in which we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to do work in certain kinds of ways. And obviously things have to change at the moment for very necessary reasons. But it's actually a good pause point for reflection to think about broadly the ways in which we do things and how we might do things better, and what kinds of problems that we make for ourselves, perhaps. So we pushed the event, certainly from the Open Lab perspective, back a bit in the calendar. And then we noticed that some of our colleagues were similarly interested in doing other things. And NORTHLab over at Northumbria have been running a really interesting series of panel discussions over the last couple of months. And lots of people, lots of you watching this, I'm sure, have sat in on the panel discussions that have been happening over the road. So we thought it would be nice to kind of combine efforts and do something that might stretch out over a week. So we have this relatively light framing, a HCI Summer Festival, somewhat whimsical perhaps, but we think it's an interesting opportunity to have kind of like a moment of reflection and an opportunity to think about some of the stuff that we do, some of the work that we do and the ways in which we do it. You'll see if you look at the programme, we have quite a variety of sessions over the week. There's all sorts of activities going on from now until Friday. Some of them are very open sessions, some of them have to be slightly closed sessions because they've got much smaller groups, and as we're doing it, we're experimenting across the week with different kinds of formats, different kind of methods for running online workshops, doing panel discussions, trying to think about things and how they might work differently in online formats. But we are addressing a variety of topics, but one of the overarching themes is this idea of exploring how we might do our work in different kinds of ways and how we might respond to matters of concern, as it were, that are particularly contemporary, that are affecting us at the moment. But as you look through the programme, there's all sorts of stuff. We've got workshops on zine making, we've got tech hackathon, we've got sessions about HCI education, we've got some plugging for a course that we're running next year. We have stuff about AI for blind users, demo sessions across both Northumbria and Newcastle universities. So we're kind of like demonstrating our wares in various ways. There's a beautifully titled Agony Aunt session at the end of the week for people to discuss knotty problems in HCI. There are sessions that actually look super cool for early career researchers to get people talking about the problems that they have in doing their work and starting out in HCI careers. We've got an industry session to talk about more industry focused perspectives on what you can do with HCI, especially from a career perspective. So we're really trying to think about, I suppose, the state of the nation of HCI at the moment. And that actually, to some extent, segues into what the session this morning is about, where we've got a really interesting panel discussion with 4 researchers who are going to be talking about actually 5, maybe we're up to 5, talking about some of the contemporary concerns that they're dealing with and reflecting on topics that I think are quite germane to the whole of the HCI community at the moment. Before I launch into a kind of like a bit of a quick description of some, I suppose, ground rules, if you will, for the week, some sort of do's and don'ts. I just want to invite John Vines. John, is there anything you want to add in from the Northumbria perspective?
Not particularly, Dave. I think you've really nicely you've covered it all there, including the sort of the prehistory about how originally, I guess, we were in isolation, organising two separate events. There was going to be an OpenLab Summer Festival, and Alex Taylor and his colleagues at HCID at City, and a bunch of us at Northumbria are also talking about running another event, which also happened to be this week. So it's just a big thank you to yourself and Emily at OpenLab side for first of all organising it and really ploughing on with the logistics and the planning of it all, and also Alex who really was driving forward the other event that we were hosting, and for bringing the two things together. So I don't think I have much more to say apart from that, other than thank you.
Cheers, John. That's good. Sorry, I did ramble on, didn't I? Right, so some ground rules for the week. So across the various sessions, I think unless you're asked otherwise, it would be good if people could try and remember to keep their mics on mute, in particular during panels and presentations, just that we avoid background noise. You know, for example, if I can get through an hour without a child running into the room and shouting something offensive, we'll be lucky. So I will be miking imminently, so turning my mic off rather. Probably best generally to have your screen on speaker view if there's a panel or presentation. Gallery view tends to be good for discussions or interactive workshops, but speaker view is probably better. Otherwise you might lose track of who's actually talking. And then you might, if it's a big room, you're going to actually find it hard to find them again. Right, we have, if you want to ask questions, please in Zoom use the raise a hand function or put questions in the chat window. And we have Emily and Daniel in the background who are going to help try and collect stuff. In the very rare circumstances that we get Zoom bombed by enterprising teenagers or something like that, then Emily reserves the right to bounce people out of the room. That includes any participants who start getting leery. It is possible that we kind of like remove people, but it seems highly unlikely. If any sessions get too big, so I think we can have up to 300 people. It's unlikely that we'll top that, but if you can't get into a room at any point during the week, then go and check out the OpenLab YouTube channel. Stuff will be live streamed to there, I believe. And if you would like to tweet about stuff, then we do have a specific hashtag for the week, which is hashtag HCI Summerfest. So do feel free to tag comments on various social media. And then we do actually in this session have a little bit of an extra task that we'll talk about later on. And this meeting is being recorded. That's a timely reminder. Yes, so bear that in mind if you ask any questions or make any comments. I think most of the sessions will be streamed and they will be recorded. So be mindful of, I suppose, of what you say and how you say it, and be respectful. And with that then, I will hand over to my colleagues, I think possibly Angelica maybe up first to start introducing the next bit, which is the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Dave. And yeah, thank you for passing on to me. I guess I have the interesting job of kind of starting off the conversation on the panel on contemporary issues in HCI. And I'll be joined by Abby Durant and Rimtal Hook and Alex Taylor as we kind of progress the conversation. We each have our own little bits to a whole conversation. So please do see these in conversation with one another, not as entirely separate pieces or separate conversations. So we're at a time in HCI where we have moved towards doing research in the world, but where many areas of HCI research are also still engaging with traditional experiments and traditional forms of doing research. We have people working on projects that aim to advance social justice ideals and are developing interdisciplinary ways of understanding technologies, for example, through post-colonial computing, critical disability studies, critical race studies, different forms of feminist research, and many different other critical areas of research. But at the same time, we continue to see work that reinforces the technologies and approaches some of us have been critiquing for years. We're not just the social justice HCI community, we are a wider community of disparate conversations that are at great odds with one another at times. But HCI isn't just about the research we produce and talk about. It's about the universities in which we do this work, our research groups, and the wider community. It's about who is and who feels welcome in these spaces. We can't talk about contemporary HCI without talking about recent discrimination experienced by the Race, Diversity, and Inclusion team. And we can't talk about that as an isolated incident. The bravery of the authors of the blog post cannot be understated, but we also have to ask ourselves, and I have to ask myself, what have I done and continue to do to perpetuate the system? And then I must act on those reflections. This is not the first time people have spoken up about mistreatment and discrimination in relation to HCI or the ACM, and it won't be the last. I know of papers that have received shocking reviews that discredit the work for years to then receive Best Paper awards when the publication venue was ready. Articles for a Crossroads special issue were heavily edited or forcefully removed by senior editors when they were deemed inappropriate. And it required the work of so many, building on anger, tears, and fear for their own safety in response to an awful keynote in 2018, for people to come together to write an open letter that was read at the town hall meeting that year. FemPower Tech and I were heavily involved with this letter and have been told that this played a part in the establishment of the inclusion teams, of which race is one. And now the teams that were born out of inequities and exclusion are themselves experiencing marginalization. But this time, perhaps this is even more harmful for those involved. Before it could be explained away as indifference or ignorance, but what are we going to do now? We write so carefully about inclusion, inequities, and social justice in our research. We now must also live this way of working. I want to read a segment from the 2018 open letter in response to the keynote, which seems incredibly relevant, again, 2 years later. So the letter said that this discrimination is a catalyst and symptom of wider issues in HCI and Hci that we have chosen to strategically avoid over the last few years. Yes, there have been campaigns, policies, and actions, but the fact that this happened shows that inclusion is still a work in progress. We need to learn to encounter, address, acknowledge, and constructively deal with these differences democratically and collectively, rather than relying on top-down decision-making consensus. This letter is a call for social change that is complex and nuanced and necessary, something we have to work on together, and something that is an ongoing conversation about intersectional inclusivity of varied experiences across ACM membership. We need to stop the self-congratulation about being the best conference in relation to diversity and inclusion in the ACM, as this gives the false impression that the job is done. Instead, we must celebrate our small victories and simultaneously work towards becoming a better, more welcoming and retaining space for the most marginalized in our HCI community. That was the bit of the letter. And reading that now, 2 years later, it's still incredibly relevant, but it's also nice to be able to read it without tears streaming down my face like they did 2 years ago. But the fact that we're having these conversations and that we're having this panel and that we're responding to not just what happened recently, but what continues to happen and has happened for so long, is that we're taking a step in the right direction. So I don't want to end on just an entirely negative note, but these are little steps, and they're steps that are continuously, hopefully, being taken, but they're also very difficult and potentially quite hurtful steps to ourselves and the actions we have taken in the past. But they are steps that we must continue to take. And hopefully with this panel, and I know that Abby is going to take one perspective on the different kinds of steps we can take going forward.
Thanks, Angelica. That was a great set of provocations and important, really important points that we hopefully will hold and act on all week and going forwards. So, yeah, so following on from that, Angelica has started to draw out an interesting discussion about current challenges that might require rethinking how we frame HCI research. And one area where this is seen to be relevant, and particularly so in response to COVID-19, is the consideration of concepts of care. And I'm just going to try and offer some reflections on my recent experiences of working as a design researcher in HCI, navigating the UK response to COVID-19, and specifically working on a digital healthcare project where racial inequalities are right in focus, along with the politics of representation. So I'm working in the HIV sector in the UK with peer researchers who are experts in the lived experience of HIV. Caro Clace is joining us this morning, and I work closely with Caro. The project team is committed to practicing co-creative and participatory methods whereby research is co-defined and co-produced with partners who represent the end user population for the designs. And the team is gathering accounts about living with HIV that aim to illuminate the challenges of collecting and sharing personal data about one's own life to support the self-management of HIV as a long-term condition, and trying to understand what it means for a person living with HIV to communicate this data to healthcare professionals, to peers, other organisations, or to contribute to public health surveillance. So HIV therefore provides a specific socio-medical context for HCI research, where ideas about data and its representation present significant design challenges. And this has led our team to consider very deeply the politics of care. And something to highlight in our work to date is that healthcare provision forms part of much wider networks of care, or circles of care, as we refer to them. And this includes formal and non-formal networks. So this is understood as hugely significant for achieving quality of life and well-being. Peer support in particular is a practice that brings peers together in safe spaces. And in response to COVID, the routine in-person peer support groups and services have actually been found to be very disrupted. So many peers are connecting exclusively online. Some are calling each other on the telephone. And if someone receives a call, then there is an understanding that they will in turn call a friend to see how they are. And this is how, during the pandemic, some circles of care between peers are sustained. And colleagues and respondents that we've been working with talk about how making these calls can come with a burden or a labour, and it can become hard work, especially when, for example, HIV medication means that sleep is disrupted and that being shielded during the pandemic builds anxiety and a weight of feeling locked down. Beyond peer support, being an HIV advocate can also involve a lot of work, especially at this time. And as researchers and peer researchers working with us, we must be mindful of how doing research in the current moment becomes burdensome, as much as it can be seen to be more important than ever. And this sense of recognising care as complex and multidimensional has been put forward by Maria Puig de la Bellacasa in her work, Matters of Care. She contests the idea that care is just about the benevolent act of caring or caregiving and a positive feeling of receiving care. And she describes how caring can feel good or bad, that it can do good or bad, that it can feel like a moral, political or ethical obligation or a burden. And she reminds us academics that we should be mindful of how we conceptualize care and practices of care in our orientations to research. Another feminist writer, Michelle Murphy, engages this thinking in relation to the infrastructures of healthcare systems, considering how non-innocent histories may be rehearsed in the delivery of health and social care at an institutional level. Again, Murphy invites us to critically reflect on matters of care. And at the current time, commentators in the UK and beyond are interpreting rapid reviews and emerging evidence about how long-standing inequalities that affect BAME groups may be exacerbated by COVID. There is seen to be a lack of trust in our National Health Service here in the UK by some BAME groups, including in the HIV sector, and in turn a recognised need for trust building, a need to find ways forward that are founded on approaching care in all its complexity and in recognition of structural inequities. So we may ask, what does this mean for HCI researchers and for developing participatory methods in health research? There may be value in responding to the current moment by actively reflecting on the politics of care and its intersubjectivities, and raising questions like, how do we practice responsible research that is mindful to recognise how structural injustices like racism, discrimination, stigma, may be identified in partnership with communities, genuinely in partnership with communities, and responded to in terms of meaningful dialogue and meaningful collective action? And how do we research with care and in respectful dialogue? So on the project that I've just referred to, the Intuit project, we're using poetic inquiry to explore this in core collaboration and partnership with the Terence Higgins Trust. And what is good about the festival this week is that workshops and panels are bringing people together in informal networks to explore new ways to respond to the current moment. And with that, I'll pass over to Alex.
Thank you, Abby. I just wanted to say before I sort of turn to the topics I want to briefly mention today, it's just so nice to see so many familiar faces on Zoom. And when I was imagining this, I had an image of Dave standing up on a podium, which is a bizarre thought now. It feels like we're all living a very different kind of situation, and it's always nice to see faces on Zoom and what have you. And I know not everyone can turn their videos on, but it's nice to catch a glimpse of some of you. So I guess listening to Angelica and Abby, I'm reminded that we're in such a particular moment, and I know it's so cliched right now that we hear on the radio and TV about unprecedented moments. And I think, not just for those of us in HCI, but for those of us worldwide, we're feeling these really pressing questions around how we respond to a pandemic, of course, but also more recently, issues around race and exclusion and inequalities. And I think that, that's what Angelica obviously responded to at HCI a few years ago, and is obviously, that's something that feels very close to us right now. And Abby's great work with the Intuit project similarly is dealing with intersectional questions. So it's not obviously not just about healthcare, but it's about those who get excluded through these systems and structures that claim to attend to questions of care. And so I think for HCI, I guess for me, we get caught up in the nuts and bolts of designing systems. And yet moments like this remind us that technologies are deeply implicated in these structures. And that's what I guess I want to turn to, is that I want to talk about how inequality and justice fold into wider technoscientific structures that, in a way, as much as we'd like to deny it, we're always and have already been complicit in building systems and structures that are inherently discriminatory And that's a hard thing to accept. But the thing I think that I guess I want to focus on is this question of complexity. And this is something I don't think Daniela Rosner is on the call, but Daniela Rosner and I have been thinking about, that complexity is something that somehow captures a contemporary moment. You know, many of us write about the entangled relations between technologies and ourselves, about networks or actor networks. And so in a sense, we get enthralled by the idea of complexity. And certainly in technological circles, complexity seems to be something we're continually trying to work with. And yet, in some sense, we want to reduce the world. We have a compulsion to use technologies and to use computation to reduce the world to something that's less than the world that we live in. So in a sense, we want to use technology to resolve complexity. And what Daniela and I have been talking about is instead, how do we hang on to complexity? How would we hang on to complexity in a world in which people are being structurally discriminated against, where racism is so prevalent? How do we avoid this idea that we resolve those things? You know, it seems arrogant, to say the least, that we might somehow resolve these things that have been ongoing for centuries. And so how do we work with those things rather than reduce them? And I was thinking about something that I know many of us on the call will have been thinking about, and that's contact tracing. And, you know, that's just such a nice example of how the challenges of contact tracing are being presented to us just on the radio this morning in terms of a technical problem of spatial locationing. And we all know how hard it is to triangulate someone's location with something like Bluetooth. I think it's probably near impossible. So to us, it won't be surprising that there are technical challenges to that. But of course, it's much more than that. With my family, we were having a discussion. I've got a 10-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. And we were talking about, well, who do we get to decide what our bubble is? Because, you know, obviously my daughter wants to hang out with her friends and my son wants to hang out with his friends. And so all of a sudden we're in a quandary about, well, whose bubble matters more? And of course, you know, my partner and I have our own friends. And so we have if you like, a local dynamic, a family dynamic. A problem arises around what constitutes location and what constitutes contact. But I think it's even more profound than that. It's who has the choice to be in and out of contact with one another. And of course, not everyone has those choices. And again, this is something that's been covered well in the popular press, that not everyone has the option not to go to work. Not everyone has the option not to be touched or to touch. And you know, I think this is something that Abby references in her work, that touch is such seen to be such a universal, and yet it's so distinct in particular populations and across particular populations. So I guess I don't want to reduce those problems. I think that, you know, we might think of contact tracing as a technical problem. We might think of it as a household problem, or we might think of it as this much deeper structural problem. And what interests me in HCI and design is to think, well, how do we work across those, if you like, if those spaces? How do we hang on to them all together? So for me, this is about finding a way to resist breaking down the world into manageable chunks and neat classifications. That we feel compelled in HCI because many of us come from technological fields or the harder ends of social science to classify and to categorize. And yet those forms of classification, if you like, to my mind, do damage, potentially do violence, that we can't we can't allow ourselves to think of bodies as uniform objects of surveillance, and we need to resist seeing things like touch and contact as universals that are easily traced and enumerated. We know in our hearts, in our bodies, that touch is so much more than that. And so why would we imagine that we can build a technology that somehow captures touch in that sense? So maybe this is an opportunity to stop trying to reduce life, to stop trying to collapse complexity, and in our case, to resist using technology to do this. So I just wanted, in closing, to kind of refer to a couple of scholars who have inspired me along the way in thinking about this. And I guess one of them is Arundhati Roy has recently written a short essay, which I think is going to be part of a new book of hers, where she talks about the pandemic as a portal. The pandemic is a moment in which we might imagine otherwise. And I really like the way Arundhati Roy talks about traveling light, that we might somehow lose the weight of oppressive histories and norms in this particular moment, and think about a way forward in which, I guess to echo my point, in which we might somehow look beyond these classifications and categories that are so deeply troubling. And Arundhati Roy talks nicely of how, of course, traveling light is something that rich people have the privilege of doing, and that actually, if you look at, for example, the films of people in India moving back to their villages after the lockdown and what have you, people are traveling with many things. And so if you like, those that are challenged often have to carry the greatest burden and the greatest weight. And I think this is a moment in which we have to rethink those relationships. And the second point I want to draw on is from the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who writes at the end of her book on living a feminist life about a collective project. And for me, this is a project. It's a project of protest. It's a project of resistance. And I know those words might sound somewhat militant to some, but I think we need to be in that moment in which we are continually working together to resist some of these forms of injustice and discrimination, things like long histories of racism, that we're obliged to do that as people in privilege, and that we can't sit back and think that it's okay to let these things happen, that we've been given the luxury of time and space to somehow be academic scholars. And so I draw heavily on people like Sarah Ahmed to think about these projects of collective resistance. And I call on our community to work in that way, to work together, and to echo Abby's thoughts on care, to do that with care. And that's not an easy task. Many of us will feel challenged working in that way, and will feel sometimes angry at the kinds of responses that we see to forms of injustice or discrimination. And this speaks to Angelica's reference to some of the things that are happening at the moment in our community, where there is an anger and there is a sense of people feeling as though they're being picked on. But we need to work with care across our community and show that we're invested as a collective effort, and it's a collective energy in resisting these forms of discrimination, and and this isn't separate somehow from design. This is all about design. It's about the design of the systems that we build, but the design of the community that we're in. So I'd like to hand over to Reem, who I think will try and kind of set things up as a call to action.
Hi, I'm just going to apologize beforehand. Our neighbors are doing some work. So if it sounds like the house is falling down on me, I'm fine. Thank you, Alex, and everyone. I think So what Angelica, Abby, and Alex have pointed out too is that social injustices exist within our research communities and also within our wider communities that we live in. And they've been building up over the years, and they truly reflect the complexity of our societies. And the issues that have been referred to are not only specific to HCI. A review of literature related to the Syrian conflict has found that 92% of research publications had no collaboration with authors affiliated with institutions in Syria, and only 55% of them had authors who were based in neighboring countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, where the research was actually conducted. The numbers go down much further if you look at the affiliation of the first authors. And this really reflects how our publication systems contribute to these social inequities when it comes to research. And I would be really interested in seeing this type of analysis done within our HCI community, and also to look at equity across the global South in general when it comes to this. The fact that these issues are persistent means that we need to start addressing them in different ways, much like what Alex, Abby, and Angelica have referred to. And we need to ask ourselves, as a research community, do we need more committees, i.e. mechanisms of reform, or is now the time for us to look towards transformations as a whole and not just as a part? The RAISE team and Jen Mankoff have called on the wider community to instigate much needed change. When reading them, I really found myself thinking of Kentaro Toyoma's and Freeman et al.'s call for aspirational design. We not only work to address the needs of marginalized communities in the here and now, but we have to look forward towards a better future. So it is with this in mind that we are encouraging all of you throughout this week and beyond that to be aspirational. Share with your wider community the transformations that we should aspire to. And these aspirations can be at an individual level, but also as importantly at a structural level. We are asking everyone to consider, how do we make sure that social justice, diversity, and equity are at the heart of our work and not just at the periphery? How do we move forward and transform our systems to counter issues that are deeply entrenched in our societies, such as racism, first and foremost, and then work from there? And I know that this sounds very utopian, but if we don't start aspiring for an HCI community that is socially just, we will be maintaining the dystopias that many of our community members experience every day now. So again, just share using the hashtag and any other forms that you want, your aspirations for the transformations that we need as a community and for the systems we are in, and engage in those dialogues and think of, where do we go from here and where do we want to be? I think that's kind of my thoughts on the matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Reem. That was really cool. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Angelica, Abby, Alex, and Reem. That was really cool. So, just to kind of like re-emphasize there, I think Reem's last point. It would be very nice if, over the course of this week, we could have everybody tweeting or using whatever social media platform you like, using the hashtag. Just put it in the chat window. Aspirational HCI, like send images out there that represent, you know, what HCI research looks like at this time for you, right? What you want it to be, you know, what's an aspirational vision of HCI research? Where should we be going with this? So tweet, I don't know, Facebook, any other social media platforms you like, even TikTok responses, that seems to be very of the moment. So why not dance your response in relation to a soundtrack, but make sure you use the hashtag. And then we will gather them up actually, and I think we'll try and do something interesting with them by the end of the week. I think that would be quite nice, maybe if we gather at the end of the week to see like, you know, some of these responses from people. I think that would be super cool. So we can do a bit of kind of collective imagining about where we are and where we want to go within this community that we have. So at this point, we have maybe like about 15 minutes left in the session, and I'm conscious that some people will need to get straight off. I know Abby might need to leave like 5 minutes earlier, because these meetings keep stacking. That's our new Zoom life. So we do have the floor though for questions, and this might be a little bit clunky, but if people would like to ask questions, now is the time to do it. So either stick questions in the chat window quickly, or try and raise your hand, and I will try and observe that, and Emily will try and help us, and we'll see if there are any questions that we can field to any of our speakers. So don't be shy, shout out, or flag yourself, and we'll see if we pick it up. Okay, maybe then, if there's nothing from the floor that I can see at the moment, maybe I'll start us off. So mindful, very mindful of what Alex was saying about not reducing complexity. I wonder if everyone would like to offer something that they think is perhaps the best starting point for making change. Come on, one of you jump in.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Something happened and
So
broke off.
what would you think is the best way of starting to try and make change? If you could prioritize something, where should we be starting?
I think we should start by looking what has already been done. So this, I feel like this question of where do we start always comes up, and it continues to come up every single time something happens, because we always see whatever happened, whatever discrimination or misrepresentation or abuse or whatever happened, we always see that as an isolated incident. And then we always ask, how can we rectify this? What can we do to learn from this? Which, yes, you need to learn from every incident, but you also need to learn from the collection of incidents and from what comes together. And I think Reem said it really nicely in what she was saying as well. Like, this keeps happening, and we keep talking about how we can change it. So maybe we need to stop talking about where we can start and actually just putting into practice what people have been saying we need to put into practice for a very long time. Because, I mean, you can see it in wider politics as well. There's always another inquiry. There's always, like Reem said, another committee being set up. But actually, we have a lot of tools. There's decades, centuries of feminist research, of critical race theory research, of critical disability research that we just need to read and cite and reference and acknowledge and put into practice. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has thoughts in relation to that, or if I'm just talking absolute rubbish. Yeah.
I 100% agree. We do need to look back at what has happened, but also equally, I feel like we need to kind of shed off the old ways. So we need to forget that this is how we've always done conferences, and rather say, right, racism is an issue that is affecting a lot of people within our community. If we start with an anti-racist conference, how will that mechanism and structures move forward? And it is a large thing, but there's also smaller things. So all the different times where panels have been set up and they're like, right, we need to make this diverse by this date because this is the date we're going to have this conference or panel. Well, my question is, well, why don't you start by asking the diverse people that you want to involve and then decide on that? And I know it's not easy. I know that there's different financial structures and everything around it, but maybe we should start asking ourselves of what do we want it to look like in the end? and then work our way backwards.
Thanks, Reem. I feel actually like, well, personally, I owe a huge amount to many of the people on this call, on this Zoom channel, and groups like Femtech Power, that, you know, to take a risk, to be emboldened, to be seen, particularly if you're an early career researcher, to stand on the margins. And well, I suppose risk is a privilege, you know, and those of us who are senior in the field are willing or not willing sometimes to take those risks. And so I think personally, I suppose my own exercise here is to take risks, and to be willing to be part of what so many of the people on this call have started, or maybe added to. I think, you know, Hci, in some sense, I feel, is in a really exciting phase of its history, that many people feel energized, and that, you know, some of the people on this call at least will remember that 3 or 4 years ago we just wouldn't be having this conversation, and it's thanks to so many people here that we are. And so I feel energized by that. I feel humbled by it, because I think, you know, in some ways, you know, I wouldn't have been having this conversation without many of you. So again, to me, it's that sort of, that collective enterprise of being willing to take risks together, and enabling each other to take those risks, and feeling some sense of camaraderie about it.
Yeah, I really share Reem, Angelica, and Alex's thoughts here, and actually I was just thinking, very much building on what you've just said, Alex, you really have to accept that it's not going to be comfortable trying to do this, and that it does take some courage. And sort of ironically, it's often those who have a sense of privilege that actually have the confidence to take risks anyway. So there's something circular there, but really genuinely being mindful of what it means to respond to this work that in particular was referred to in the panel. And actually, this is the thing, like with the festival this week, what's so lovely about it is it's a space where people have this shared understanding that it's experimental, and that there's a sense of informality around it that's great, because it gives people this sense of personal freedom to experiment with ideas and new, you know, methods or practices, you know, looking at all the things that are on over the week. And I think that's really, you know, that's really important. And so, you know, I'm sure there'll be lots of really meaningful discussions and stuff happening over the week that will actually sort of create this opportunity for pausing, and for really maybe taking yourself to a kind of less comfortable place to challenge some of the assumptions, you know, that we all kind of unwittingly build into our thinking and our practices. Yeah. But so that's why I think, you know, kind of excited about what's going to be following on in the festival.
Cool. Thank you very much, Abby. And I think that's a really kind of like good point perhaps to end with, unless there are any other burning questions. I'm looking at the chat window and I'm looking for raised hands, but right. Signal now or forever hold your peace. I think that final point though was really interesting and like super useful, and I thank you everybody actually for that discussion at the end there. I do think one of the privileges that we have as an academic community is that we are in a space where we can try to construct robust discussion and dialogue, at least amongst our community, and we should always be outward looking. And this is not always easy though. And there are structures that can stop that from happening, and we need to be mindful of that. And I think we, especially within academia, within our own pond, we need to think about how we can facilitate different voices, and especially often I think of junior academics, because I think in certainly in the American system, I think there are very serious structural barriers to people feeling like that they can say anything. The tenure track system is a killer. I don't think it's anything like as bad in the UK or in Europe, but we still have our own kind of structural inequities that can stop people feeling like they can take part in a dialogue. And we have to acknowledge that and think about it and think about how we can work around that. But that is, I think, ultimately the privilege of being academics, is that we are in a position where we can try and do that, and we have some agency in that, in constructing our own worlds. So we are very, very privileged. Okay, so I'm going to draw everything to a close then. And I will just like raise to the floor, like I just see in the chat window chatting there, ironically in the chatting window, pointing out that HCI has to examine its reliance on the scientific method. Well spoken by a designer, fair point. Okay, things to think about, I think. Things to think about. So what's going to happen now is there will be, I believe, a half-hour break, and then for those that are interested in coming on to the next session, it'll be back in this room. I believe there is a demo session happening in this same room at 11:30. So if you're choosing to treat this like a conference this week, then go and make yourself a weak coffee and have a strange conversation with someone that you don't really know, maybe a soggy muffin, and then come back at 11:30 and enjoy some demo time. And please do enjoy the week and use the hashtag and let everyone know what you think. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to our speakers, and thank you to Emily for keeping everything going once again. And with that cue, I have a child running into the room.
Thank you, dear. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody.